You know, everybody has a story, and my story, I guess, has taken some different twists and turns than some other people. I had a very strict upbringing. My parents were both from another country. My dad was a freedom fighter. He came over from Hungary in 1956, and my mother came over from Poland in 1948. They met in Buffalo, New York. At first they didn't like each other. My grandfather on my mother's side brought my father over to teach my mother to drive. But when I was growing up, you know, we lived in a community where my father did have a lot of Hungarian friends, and they'd come over and they'd speak different languages. You know, my mom would go back to Buffalo, New York to visit her parents, and they would speak different languages, and that was just what they did. And typically they would speak in another language so that I wouldn't understand. My brother and I would go and we'd hang out for, you know, whether it would be Easter or Christmas or something like that. And when they didn't want us to know what they were talking about, they'd speak in a different language. So it was an interesting upbringing. My father was self-made. He came over here. He taught himself how to read and write. It was an interesting story. When I was probably 12 years old, we were in Buffalo, and my grandfather on my mother's side looked at my dad. My dad was reading the newspaper, and he said, "I can't believe he could just sit down and read the newspaper." And, you know, being born here and going through, you know, the education and everything else and through grammar school, I didn't quite understand what that meant. But then my grandfather said, "You know, your father taught himself how to read and write." When I came over, I went to school, and it was very difficult for me to learn the English language and to learn how to write and read. But he said that my father basically taught himself how to read and write by looking at automotive magazines. He looked at back in that day, Hot Rod magazine, things like that. He would relate the words to a car, work on a car, and essentially taught himself how to read and write. You know, taught himself how to weld, taught himself how to work on cars. So he was absolutely self-made, came to this country with absolutely nothing. He escaped the Russians when they were invading Hungary, and he left with two other guys. Got to New Jersey. When he came over, he flew over and they landed in New Jersey. Got to New Jersey, and they had a couple of homes, one in Cleveland, and a community in Cleveland and a community in Buffalo that would help Hungarian refugees. He got on the bus to go to Buffalo. He got to the terminal in Buffalo, and he started looking in the phone book for familiar names so that he could see names that looked Hungarian, and started trying to call people because they gave him a little bit of money so that, you know, once he got off the bus, he had a little bit of money so he can find a place, get something to eat, and then go out and try to find a job. Found a house and lived in Buffalo. And again, the two guys he left with, he never saw again. They kind of went separate ways, and they probably didn't make it. So, and my father had to leave there because they were fighting against the communists. And there were some incidents that he never told me about, but he couldn't go back until the late 70s when we all went back as a family, because he had to get his citizenship, and he had to get amnesty from the Hungarian government, which was still under Russian control, before he could go back and see his parents. So he essentially left his country, left his family, and didn't see him again for 20 years. When I was, again, probably about 13 or 14, and this, you got to bear with me on this. This is an interesting story. We were at the racetrack, and it was approaching midnight, and it was a well-known fact that the gentleman that owned the racetrack at the time was Jewish, and they were going to have to. The owner of the track was going to have to pay for extending past midnight. He'd have to pay a fine because there was a curfew. So my dad was in like the semifinals, and I was a young kid, and, you know, full of piss and vigor, and you know, standing there, and I said, "Oh, that cheap Jew, you know, he won't pay the $200 fine." And my mother said, "Shut up, you're Jewish." And I said, well, what does that mean? So then she started to tell me the story that she grew up and she lived in the ghetto in Poland. They had a big farm, and her great-grandparents and her grandparents were killed. They were lined up and they were shot in the head, and then they gathered up my grandparents, my mom, her sister, and their cousin, and they took them to what was called the ghetto. And they were slated to go to a concentration camp. And when they were coming in and getting people out of the ghetto in Poland to take them to the concentration camp, there was a Christian family that took them in, and they literally hid in an attic for a year. So when the war was over and they finally came over to the United States, they were very paranoid about telling anybody what religion they were, where they came from, what they did, because their family was persecuted. And until the day my mother died, she used to get a check from the government for restitution, from the German government, $90-some a month. And I never knew what that was. She used to always call it retirement, but later on I found it was restitution for what happened to her family. So again, I mean, they grew up the hard way. I mean, they didn't have the upbringing I had. They didn't have the opportunity I had, but they made their own way and they made their opportunity. And that's as much inspiration, I think, as anybody could have. When I was starting my business, Aeromotive, I use that as inspiration. Whenever people feel like it's difficult or it's tough, or I was trying to get investors and you get frustrated and you work hard, I always dug deep and said, what I'm doing is nothing compared to what my parents did. They came here with nothing. They taught themselves how to read and write. They taught themselves, they had a great work ethic. And so again, I had an education. I was born here. I could speak the language. So starting a business and doing what I do is nothing compared to what they had to live through and create a life for my brother and I.
If your mom and dad had been here to see you, if you had the chance to speak to them, what would you say?
You had to go there, didn't you? I don't know that I can answer that. I mean, this is what we do. This is a lifestyle. I built cars with my dad.
What's the most profound lesson they taught you in life? If you could sum it up.
Don't complain, don't give up.